Grady Cole was only a mechanic in the hangar, the kind of man who came in early, left late, and never said more than one sentence when he was looked down on. But that morning he refused to sign the safety clearance for Bancroft Aerosystems' brand new jet. CEO Adelaide Bancroft exploded, firing him in front of the entire technical crew and calling him a man who stood in the company's way. Her whole circle applauded. Then Chairman Sterling Rockwell walked in, opened a single folder, and said, "Fire all of them. If you love spine-chilling reversals, subscribe now so you never miss the next story on this channel." The morning air inside Hangar 7 at Bancroft Aerosystems still carried the cold of the Texas night, a mineral chill that clung to the concrete floor long after the sun had crossed the flat horizon outside. Grady Cole moved through that chill the way he moved through everything, without noise, without complaint, a travel mug of black coffee cooling on a rolling tool cart beside him. He was 51 years old, though the lines around his eyes and the gray creeping into his close-cropped hair made some of the younger engineers guess higher. He wore the same faded coveralls he had worn for 3 years, the name patch on the chest scuffed pale, and he carried himself with the quiet economy of a man who had learned long ago that the loudest person in a room was rarely the one who understood the machine. Around him the hangar breathed with the low hum of ventilation, and the distant clang of a wrench dropped 2 bays over, and Grady listened to all of it the way other men listened to music. At the center of the hangar, gleaming under the high sodium lights, sat the reason everyone at Bancroft had been working double shifts for 6 weeks. The Bancroft B-17 Meridian was a private jet built to save the company's year, a sleek machine of polished aluminum and carbon composite that the marketing department had already photographed from 40 angles. Executives spoke of it in reverent tones, as if it were less an aircraft than a promise. Grady looked at it differently. Where others saw a symbol, he saw 1,000 systems that all had to agree with one another before the thing left the ground, and he had spent the last 4 mornings finding places where those systems quietly disagreed. He did not resent the jet. He simply refused to pretend it was finished when it was not. His phone buzzed against the steel of the cart, and the screen lit with a photograph of a teenage girl making an exaggerated face. Marin, his daughter, 16 years old and already sharper than he had been at 30. He wiped the grease from his thumb and answered, and her voice came through bright and quick, reminding him that he had forgotten to eat lunch 2 days in a row, and that a person could not fix airplanes on coffee alone. He laughed softly, a sound he saved almost exclusively for her, and told her he might be late tonight because a certain airplane still would not tell him the truth. She groaned the way teenagers do, told him to at least buy a sandwich, and said she loved him before hanging up to catch her bus. Grady stood a moment with the dark phone in his hand, and something in his chest tightened the way it always did when he remembered that everything he did for her. He turned back to the Meridian and to the readings he had been chasing since Monday. Deep in the fuel balancing system, the numbers wandered in a way they should not. The pressure sensors on the right wing reported values that drifted by small margins under changing load, and while a fraction of a percent meant nothing on a spreadsheet, Grady knew what it could mean in a strong crosswind at altitude. If the aircraft flew its certification test in gusting conditions, the balancing software might read the wrong load distribution and correct for a problem that did not exist while ignoring one that did. There was no crash in his mind, no dramatic vision of fire and falling metal. There was only the cold arithmetic of risk, and the arithmetic told him plainly that this airplane was not ready to be certified. He had raised it already, 2 days earlier, with Bryce Hollister, the hangar chief. Bryce was a broad man with a loud laugh and a talent for repeating whatever the executives wanted to hear, and he had listened to Grady's report the way a man listens to a weather forecast that inconveniences his weekend. He had waved the printout aside and reminded Grady that the executive floor had promised this aircraft to a client, that a mechanic did not have the authority to stand in the way of a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and that people who forgot their place did not keep their jobs long. Grady had not argued. Arguing with Bryce was like arguing with a locked door. Instead, when the shift quieted and the others drifted toward the break room, Grady walked to the small printer in the corner of the technician's office and pulled every line of the anomaly data, every sensor log, every timestamp. He folded the pages once, slid them into a brown envelope, and set the envelope inside the locked drawer of his tool chest. He did not fully understand yet why he felt the need to keep a private copy. He only knew from long and painful experience that the truth had a way of vanishing inside companies like this one, and that a man who wanted to protect it had to hold a copy where no one else could reach. 2 floors above the hangar, in a glass-walled conference room that overlooked the runway, Adelaide Bancroft was already losing patience. She was 43 years old, immaculate in a charcoal suit, her dark hair pulled back so severely that it seemed to sharpen the angles of her face. She had the particular stillness of a person accustomed to silencing a room simply by entering it, and she wore that stillness the way she wore everything, deliberately. To Adelaide, Bancroft Aerosystems was not merely a company. It was the name her grandfather had built and her father had nearly lost, a legacy she had clawed back to relevance through 5 years of ruthless decisions, and she intended to be remembered as the Bancroft who had made it soar rather than the one who let it stall on the ground. The pressure that morning was real, and it was crushing. A deal with Hawthorne Private Air, a client whose fortune could move markets, hung on the Meridian flying its demonstration on schedule. The board of directors was watching the stock. The analysts were watching the board. If the aircraft slipped its date, the whisper would spread that Adelaide Bancroft could not deliver, and in her world, a whisper like that could end a career faster than any failure of engineering. She had built her entire strategy on being the leader who did not flinch, and she had no intention of flinching now over what she had been told was a rounding error in a sensor. Colton Vance, her chief operating officer, assured the room that everything was ready. He was a smooth, quick-eyed man who had learned that the fastest way to please Adelaide was to remove obstacles before she noticed them, and if removing an obstacle meant leaning on a nervous engineer until the engineer signed, he considered that simply the cost of operating at scale. He was midway through a confident summary of the demonstration timeline when the conference room door opened and Grady Cole walked in, coveralls and all, and set a stapled report on the polished table in front of the CEO. The room went cold. Adelaide looked at the report, then at the man who had brought it, and something in her expression flickered between disbelief and offense that a mechanic would interrupt her operations meeting uninvited. Grady did not sit. He said, plainly and without heat, that the aircraft should not fly its certification test until the sensor cluster was replaced and the balancing algorithm was retested, and that the data explaining why was on the pages in front of her. He spoke for perhaps 40 seconds. He did not raise his voice once. Adelaide let the silence stretch before she spoke, and when she did her voice was smooth and cold as glass. She asked him whether he understood the cost of a delay, whether he had any idea what it meant to move a demonstration for a client of Hawthorne's size, whether he grasped that decisions of this magnitude were not made by men in grease-stained coveralls. Grady met her eyes and answered just as evenly. He told her he understood the cost of letting an aircraft take off before it was ready. The sentence landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, and Adelaide felt it as a challenge. A small and infuriating act of defiance from a man she had never bothered to learn the name of. Pierce Langford, the chief legal officer, saw the temperature in the room and moved to lower it in his own particular way. He was a careful, silver-tongued man whose entire professional life had been spent finding language that protected the company from consequence, and he suggested, with the reasonableness of a man offering a favor, that perhaps Mr. Cole could simply sign a statement confirming that the anomaly did not affect flight safety. If any issue arose later, Pierce explained, the matter could be managed through the appropriate insurance provisions, and everyone could move forward. He smiled as he said it, the smile of a man who had smoothed over 100 inconvenient truths and expected to smooth over one more. Grady turned to look at him, and for the first time that morning something hardened in his face. He said that a wrong signature in a hangar did not stay in the hangar. It climbed into the sky with the airplane, he told them, and it stayed there until the airplane came down, and no insurance clause ever written had brought a single machine back to the ground once physics decided otherwise. He would not sign a statement calling a real fault harmless. He said it once, and he did not offer to say it twice. Adelaide had heard enough. In her mind, the shape of the situation had already resolved into something familiar and manageable. This was not a safety issue, she decided. This was a small man making himself large, a mechanic who had discovered a way to feel important and was now leveraging it for attention, for money, perhaps for a promotion he could never earn on merit. She had seen the type before, or believed she had, and she had built a career on refusing to be held hostage by people who mistook stubbornness for principle. She told Grady the meeting was over and that his objection was noted, in a tone that made clear the noting would go precisely nowhere. But the objection did not go away, and by the following morning Adelaide had decided that a quiet dismissal would not be enough. A matter defied her in front of her executives needed to be answered in front of the people he worked beside, so that no one else in the hangar would ever imagine that a single technician could hold $100 million program hostage. She had built her authority on the certainty that she was never wrong in public, and she intended to spend some of that certainty now. She sent word down to Hangar 7 that the entire technical crew, the hangar managers, the legal representatives, and the operations directors were to assemble at 8 o'clock sharp. They gathered in a loose semicircle on the hangar floor, 40 people or more, the fluorescent glare washing the color out of their faces. Behind them the Meridian sat gleaming and silent, its polished skin throwing back the light like a mirror, the physical embodiment of everything Adelaide had staked her name upon. Grady stood at the front in his oil-marked coveralls, the folded report still in his hand, and he did not look at the crowd. He looked at the airplane. He had stood in rooms like this before, years ago and in another life, and he recognized the particular quality of the air, the way people held very still when they sensed that someone was about to be made an example. Adelaide walked into the center of the semicircle with Colton on one side and Pierce a step behind, and she asked Grady one final time, her voice pitched to Carey, whether he would sign the safety clearance for the B-17 Meridian. Every face turned toward him. He answered without drama and without fear. "Not until the fault is fixed," he said. 4 words, flat and unhurried, and they were the last invitation she intended to give him. Her face went to ice. She announced, loud enough for the farthest technician to hear, that Grady Cole was terminated, effective immediately, for insubordination, for delaying a critical program, for damaging the interests of the company, and for what she called a pattern of obstructive behavior. Bryce Hollister jumped in at once, eager to be seen agreeing, and declared that Grady had always thought himself smarter than everyone around him. Colton added, in his smooth executive cadence, that a company worth billions of dollars could not allow itself to be held back by one stubborn mechanic. A few in the crowd stayed silent, their eyes on the floor, afraid that any expression at all might cost them their own jobs. Others, sensing which way the wind blew, actually applauded. Adelaide let the applause build for a moment, and then she delivered the line she believed would end him. "You are only a man who fixes airplanes," she said, looking at him with something close to pity. "Do not behave as though you own the sky." The words rang off the metal walls, and to nearly everyone in the hangar they sounded like the final word on the matter, the CEO putting a presumptuous laborer back in his place. Grady did not argue. He did not defend himself. He reached up and unclipped the employee badge from his chest, and he set it down gently on top of his tool chest, the plastic clicking softly against the steel. Then he looked one last time at the gleaming aircraft behind them, and he said something that no one in the hangar understood. "I hope that airplane forgives you," he said quietly, "before the sky makes you pay." Bryce laughed out loud at that, an ugly bark of a laugh, and Colton turned away to instruct another team to sign the clearance in Grady's place. But as Grady walked toward the wide hangar doors and out into the white morning light, he took out his phone and sent a single message to a number that existed in no company directory. 3 words only. "They fired me. They signed it." Then he slid the phone back into his pocket, crossed the parking lot to the old truck he had driven for 11 years, and sat down behind the wheel without starting the engine, letting the morning settle around him. The message did not travel far, but it traveled to exactly the right place. It arrived on the phone of Sterling Rockwell, chairman of the board of directors of Bancroft Aerosystems, 73 years old, a man whose name in the aviation industry carried the weight of 40 years and more than one company saved from ruin. Sterling was not merely a wealthy shareholder. He was the man who had quietly poured his own fortune into Bancroft Aerosystems during the years the family nearly lost it, before the Bancrofts reclaimed their shine and, in reclaiming it, began to forget who had steadied the ladder they climbed. He read the 3 words twice, sitting in the leather quiet of a car already moving toward the company's headquarters, and his weathered face gave nothing away. Sterling had been watching Bancroft's leadership for the better part of a year, and what he had seen worried him more each month. He had noticed the shrinking timelines and the growing pressure, the way safety reviews were compressed and inconvenient findings softened, the way the executive floor had begun to treat the certification process as a formality to be managed, rather than a promise to be kept. He suspected that Adelaide and the circle around her were trimming the company's safety culture to make the revenue numbers gleam, and he suspected it strongly. But suspicion was not proof, and a chairman who moved against a sitting CEO on suspicion alone would tear the company apart and lose the fight. What he needed was a single clear act, a decision so plainly wrong that no board member could look away from it. A falsified signature. A silenced warning, the firing of the one person who had told the truth. And Grady Cole was not the ordinary mechanic that the hangar believed him to be. He had once been a senior certification engineer, one of the most respected inspectors in the industry, before an old scandal had driven him out. Sterling had brought him back quietly, placed him in the hangar under the modest cover of a maintenance technician, and asked him to do one thing: to find out what the company's safety culture truly looked like from the inside, not from the polished reports that reached the executive floor, but from the grease and the noise where the real decisions were made. Grady had agreed, and for 3 years he had watched, and now he had found the answer in the most direct way possible. He had refused to lie, and they had fired him for it. 12 years earlier, in a different company in a different city, Grady had discovered a fault in a production line of aircraft and had refused to sign off on their airworthiness. The executives of that firm had turned the blame on him, painting him as the man who cost them a contract, and when the dust settled, he had lost his job, his reputation, and very nearly his profession. He had spent the years since taking small repair work to keep the lights on and to raise a daughter alone, fixing engines in borrowed bays at night and driving Marin to school in the morning on almost no sleep. Sterling, then only an investor circling the industry, had read the real file. He had known Grady was right, and he had done nothing, because he had lacked the power to intervene, and that silence had haunted him ever since, like a debt he could never quite repay. So when Bancroft Aerosystems began to show the same rot he had watched destroy an honest man once before, Sterling had gone looking for that same honest man. He had not wanted a report he could frame on a wall. He had wanted someone who would say no when saying no cost him everything, because he had learned, at great expense to his own conscience, that such people were rarer than any aircraft and worth more than any contract. Now, sitting in the back of his moving car with 3 words glowing on his phone, Sterling understood that the moment he had been waiting for had finally come. He told his assistant to assemble the file at once. Grady's anomaly report, the emails pressing the crew to sign, the termination record, and the list of every person who had endorsed it. Adelaide believed she had just discarded a poor mechanic. In truth, she had just signed the evidence against her own circle with her own hand. He looked out the tinted window as the car turned toward the Bancroft campus, the great hangars rising pale against the flat Texas sky, and he spoke to his assistant without turning his head. "If they choose the airplane over the people," he said, "they are not fit to run an aviation company." The assistant made a note and said nothing, and the car rolled on toward Hangar 7. Back at the hangar, the circle around Adelaide had begun to celebrate before the outcome was decided. Colton pushed the technical crew to produce a replacement signature within the hour, moving from bench to bench with the brisk certainty of a man who believed problems disappeared the moment they were assigned to someone else. A young engineer named Wesley hesitated, the pen loose in his fingers, some part of him aware that the anomaly Grady had flagged had not been resolved but merely reassigned. Bryce Hollister loomed over him and told him flatly that if he wanted to keep his job, he would sign. Wesley signed. His hand was not quite steady, and he did not meet anyone's eyes afterward. In the VIP conference room, Adelaide had begun to spin the morning into a story of triumph. She stood before a small group of investors and members of the Hawthorne team and told them, with a practiced, regretful smile, that the company had just parted ways with an employee who no longer fit its culture, a man whose old-fashioned thinking had become an obstacle to innovation. She made Grady into a lesson, a cautionary figure, the embodiment of the past that Bancroft Aerosystems had outgrown. The investors nodded. The Hawthorne representatives smiled. And along the wall stood Colton, Pierce, and Bryce, the 3 pillars of the operation, the man who pushed the schedule, the man who softened the legal exposure, and the man who ruled the hangar floor, each of them certain that after today their positions would be more secure than ever. But the first cracks had already begun to show. Somewhere deep in the company's internal compliance systems, an automated alert had triggered, flagging that a certification signature had been altered after the individual who first reported the fault had been removed from the payroll. An email arrived from the office of the board requesting that all demonstration flight activity be suspended pending review. Colton read it, decided it was routine procedure, and told his assistant to file it. Adelaide read the same message an hour later and made the same decision for a different reason. She would not let the board imagine, even for a moment, that she was a leader who could be rattled. Her flaw had never been simple ambition. Her flaw was that she could not tolerate the possibility that someone beneath her had been right when she had been wrong. Outside, in the far corner of the parking lot, Grady still had not driven home. He sat in his truck with the window cracked, the engine cool, watching the hangar doors from a distance the way a man watches weather he cannot change. His phone rang, and it was Marin. She could hear something in his voice the way children always can, and she asked him what was wrong. He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words the way he chose everything, carefully and without waste. "I lost my job today," he told her, "but maybe today I kept a lot of other people from losing more than that." She did not fully understand, and he did not explain, and after they said goodbye, he sat a while longer, feeling not triumph but a kind of weary grief, because he had run from a company like this one before, and it hurt to watch another one become the thing he had fled. He did not have to wait much longer. Just as the tow crew moved into position to roll the Meridian toward the runway for its demonstration, a line of dark cars turned in through the main gate and rolled to a stop directly inside the open mouth of Hangar 7. There was no music, no announcement, none of the noise that usually accompanied executive arrivals. There was only the sudden, heavy silence that fills a room when a person of real power walks into it, and every head on the hangar floor turned to watch Sterling Rockwell step out of the lead car. Adelaide was surprised, but she had spent her whole life turning surprise into composure, and she crossed the floor to meet him with her chin level and her voice steady. Everything had been handled, she told the chairman. The demonstration remained on schedule. Sterling looked at her with pale, unhurried eyes and asked a single question. Handled by whom? Adelaide answered without hesitation. By me. He held her gaze a moment longer, and then he raised one hand and instructed the tow crew, and everyone else within earshot, to stop all activity around the B-17 at once. Colton stepped forward to object, and it was a mistake he would not have time to regret. He said that halting the demonstration now would cost the company the Hawthorne contract, that a delay of even a day could unravel months of work, that surely the chairman understood what was at stake. Sterling turned to look at him fully for the first time, and the hangar seemed to grow colder. "Did you just tell me," Sterling said slowly, "that a client matters more than a safety certification?" The words hung in the frozen air, and Colton's mouth opened and then closed, because there was no answer to that question that did not condemn him. Sterling did not raise his voice. He reached into the leather folder his assistant handed him and began, one document at a time, to lay the morning bare. The first page was Grady's anomaly report, the sensor logs and the wandering numbers, the calm engineering language of a man describing exactly why an airplane was not ready. The second was an email from Colton to the technical crew, instructing them in plain words not to let a minor warning derail a major contract. The third was a memo from Pierce proposing the precise legal phrasing that would limit the company's liability if an incident occurred, a document that assumed in its careful sentences that an incident might. And the fourth was a still frame from the hangar's own security cameras, time-stamped that very morning, showing Bryce Hollister standing over a seated engineer as the young man signed a clearance he had not wanted to sign. Adelaide's composure began at last to fracture. She said that she had not known all of it, that the emails and the memos had been beneath her line of sight, that she could not be held responsible for every action of every director. Sterling let her finish. Then he told her, without cruelty and without mercy, that she had not needed to know all of it to be wrong. All she had needed to do, he said, was to fire the one person who had told the truth in front of everyone, so that everyone would learn the lesson she wanted taught. And that, he said, she had done with her own voice and in her own words. Then he read aloud the decision of the board. Colton Vance, Pierce Langford, Bryce Hollister, and every direct manager who had participated in pressuring the crew to sign or had endorsed the wrongful termination were suspended, effective immediately, pending a full governance investigation. The words fell one after another into the silence, and the men named in them stood rooted where they were, the certainty draining from their faces. Bryce, who moments before had been the loudest voice in the hangar, found his own voice again and asked, half in disbelief and half in anger, why a mechanic should be worth more than the entire executive team. Sterling looked at him for a long moment before he answered. Because an honest mechanic, he said, can save an airplane, and you only ever knew how to save your own chair. It was the reversal made whole. In the very hangar where they had laughed at Grady Cole not 2 hours earlier, the chairman of the board had dismissed the CEO's entire circle where they stood, and the applause that had greeted the firing had curdled into a silence no one dared to break. Adelaide believed even then that her own chair remained secure. The name on the building was hers, after all, and a Bancroft had run Bancroft Aero Systems for 3 generations. But Sterling was not finished. He told her quietly and only to her that she was being placed under governance review, and that she had lost the authority to approve any demonstration flight until the board reached its conclusions. Her control over the very machine she had staked her name upon was gone, taken from her by the man who had once saved the company she thought she owned. Adelaide's anger flared then, hot and unguarded. Bancroft was her family's name, she said. No one had the right to humiliate her in front of her own employees. Sterling answered that a family name was not a license to put a faulty airplane on a runway, and that if she believed otherwise, she had already forgotten what the name was supposed to stand for. There was no heat in his voice. There was only the flat, tired certainty of a man who had watched pride destroy better companies than this one. As Colton and Pierce were escorted from the conference room, the loyalty that had bound the circle together dissolved in an instant. Pierce said it was Colton who had pushed the schedule past all reason. Colton said Adelaide had given the green light on every decision. Bryce protested that he had only ever followed orders. The so-called loyal circle came apart the moment its own interests were threatened, each man reaching for someone else to stand between himself and the consequence. And Adelaide watched it happen and understood too late exactly what she had surrounded herself with. Sterling asked, then, for Grady Cole to be called back to the hangar. Adelaide said nothing. She was not yet ready to face the man she had humiliated, not ready to admit aloud that the mechanic in the grease-stained coveralls had been right and the CEO in the charcoal suit had been wrong. While she stood in her silence, the genuine technical team, freed at last from the pressure to sign, began a proper re-examination of the B-17, and what they found was worse than the report had promised. The fault was not a single failing sensor. It was a synchronization error between 2 separate control systems, a mismatch in the data they exchanged that could, under the right conditions, cause the aircraft to misjudge its own load and correct itself into danger. Had the Meridian flown its demonstration that morning, the consequences would not have been a footnote. The aircraft would very likely have failed its certification outright, the fault exposed in front of the very client it was meant to impress, the Hawthorne contract collapsing on the runway, and the company absorbing a loss that no quarterly report could hide. Standing in the hangar, listening to the engineers describe what they had found, Adelaide finally understood the thing she had refused to see. Grady Cole had not stood in her way. He had stepped in front of the largest mistake of her career and taken the blow so that she would not have to. When Grady returned to the hangar, he did not come through the side door as he had for 3 years. Sterling instructed the security team to open the main gate for him, and Grady walked in through the wide front entrance, the same light that had gleamed on the Meridian now falling across his coveralls. The people who had applauded his firing kept their eyes on the floor as he passed. A few of the younger engineers looked up at him with something close to gratitude, because he had said aloud the thing they had all been too frightened to say, and had paid for it so that they would not have to. Adelaide was waiting for him near the aircraft. She held herself in the posture of a chief executive, spine straight and hands folded, but her voice had changed, and everyone in the hangar could hear it. She said the company wished to invite him to return to his former position to assist with the re-examination of the B-17. It was, in its way, the most graceful offer she was capable of making, and Grady understood exactly what it cost her to make it. He shook his head, slowly, and answered without any trace of triumph. "I do not want my old position," he said. "My old position is a place where a man can be fired for telling the truth." The words were not cruel, but they were not soft either, and they settled over the hangar like a verdict. Sterling stepped forward then and announced the board's decision. Grady Cole was appointed Independent Director of Safety Certification for the entire B-17 Meridian program, reporting directly to the Board of Directors and answering to no executive officer, with the authority to ground any flight that failed to meet standard. It was a rise so complete that some of the crew could scarcely absorb it. The man who had been dismissed as a stubborn mechanic that morning now held the power to stop any aircraft in the program from leaving the ground. And in a final closing of the circle, Adelaide was required to sign the appointment herself, in front of the same technical crew who had watched her sign his termination. Where she had once put her name to the paper that cast him out, she now put her name to the paper that raised him above every officer who had cheered his fall. Grady did not gloat. He took the pen when it was offered and watched the signature dry, and then he turned to the technical crew and said the only thing he had come to say. From today, no one loses their job for refusing to sign something they know is wrong. The sentence was quiet, almost gentle, and yet several of the engineers had to look away because they had spent years believing the opposite, and it took a moment to understand that the rule had truly changed. Then, without ceremony, Grady walked to the nearest data console, pulled up the synchronization logs, and began to point out, one step at a time, exactly what would have to be corrected. He did not take his revenge by breaking the company. He took it by saving the airplane that powerful people had nearly turned into a prop for their own vanity. In the days that followed, Sterling spoke with Adelaide privately, more than once, and their conversations were not what she expected. He did not lecture her about ethics or wave her failures in her face. He told her, instead, that a good chief executive is not a person who is never wrong. A good chief executive, he said, is a person who knows how to listen to someone standing lower than themselves when that person is the one holding the truth. He told her about the man Grady had been 12 years earlier, about the fault he had found and the career he had lost, about the file Sterling had read and the silence Sterling had kept, and about how that silence had followed him for over a decade. He wanted her to understand that Grady had not come to Bancroft to destroy her. He had come because he could not bear the thought of another young engineer being forced to choose between a paycheck and a conscience. Something in Adelaide changed as she listened, and it was not the shallow embarrassment of a leader caught in a mistake. It was a deeper and more painful shame, the recognition that she had become the exact kind of leader she had once despised, the kind who mistook fear for respect and flattery for loyalty, the kind who would rather silence a warning than admit she had not heard it first. She thought of the way she had looked at Grady across the conference table, the pity in her own voice when she told him not to behave as though he owned the sky, and she understood at last that he had never claimed to own it. He had only refused to lie about what would happen to anyone who flew through it unprepared. The months that followed reshaped the company from the inside. The B-17 Meridian was rebuilt properly, its control systems resynchronized and retested until the numbers agreed with one another under every condition the engineers could invent. The project ran late, and the original Hawthorne contract very nearly slipped away, but in the end it did not, because Bancroft Aerosystems chose to make its recovery public, to stand before its clients and say plainly that it had raised its safety standards rather than quietly patched them. In an industry built on trust, that honesty proved worth more than the schedule it had cost. The new technical team operated in the open, and the engineers who had once been pressured into silence were now encouraged to raise every concern they found, without fear. Adelaide kept her position as chief executive after the investigation concluded, but the board watched her closely now, and she was required to rebuild the entire operating culture she had allowed to decay. Colton, Pierce, Bryce, and the managers who had stood with them were removed from the company altogether. There was no need to describe their leaving in harsh terms. They simply went out quietly, one after another, stripped of the authority to put their names to any document Bancroft would ever produce again. On the day before the Meridian's official certification flight, Adelaide came down to the hangar alone, without cameras, without the board, without the armor of an audience. She found Grady checking a readout near the aircraft, and she stood beside him for a moment before she spoke. "I fired you," she said at last, "because I believed my power mattered more than your truth." It was the closest thing to a confession she had ever offered anyone. Grady set down the tablet and looked at her, and his answer was not the one she braced herself for. "No," he said, "you fired me because you believed the truth needed a title before it deserved to be heard." She had no reply to that, because there was none, and the sentence stayed with her long after she left the hangar, the way certain truths do. The next morning, the B-17 Meridian lifted off the runway into a clear Texas sky, climbing clean and steady, every system agreeing with every other, the way an airplane is supposed to. Grady stood at the edge of the tarmac in his coveralls and watched it rise, one hand shielding his eyes against the sun. His phone rang, and it was Marin asking the question she had been asking for weeks. "Did you get your job back, Dad?" He watched the jet bank gently and level off, small and silver against the blue, and he thought about everything the answer could mean. "Not exactly," he told her at last. "I got back the right to tell the truth." The company he had once fled had become, in the end, a place he could believe in again. Not because the powerful had grown kind, but because a chairman had chosen people over machines, a CEO had learned the difference between authority and wisdom, and a single dad in grease-stained coveralls had refused, one more time, to sign his name to a lie. Bancroft Aerosystems learned the first lesson of the sky the way it should always be learned, before the wheels ever leave the ground. That no airplane, no matter how gleaming, is ever permitted to fly on the strength of a falsehood.